And so the important thing about all of these different domains, they define intangible cultural heritage, is that the intangible cultural heritage is transmitted from generation to generation. It passes down from grandfather to parents' generation, from parents to children. And because living culture or living heritage is, by its very definition, always changing, the idea is that the convention recognizes that the intangible cultural heritage is constantly being recreated by communities, recreated in response to changes in their environment, to interaction with nature, and to their history. So there's not the idea, unlike, for instance, archaeological conservation or architectural conservation, that there's a fixed state. You don't conserve to a particular form or to a particular look or a color or something in the way that architects will, but rather that you recognize that the tradition is in constant flux, and that's the very definition of what it is. And then lastly, in terms of the linkage between intangible cultural heritage and the community, it's recognized that intangible cultural heritage is incredibly important in giving communities a sense of identity and continuity. And so this, gives rise to the tricky question, well, what is community? And we recently organized, in fact, a regional workshop with leaders from around the Asia-Pacific region, which asked the question of heritage across borders, or shared heritage which transcends a particular boundary and can be found in multiple places. So for instance, UNESCO recently recognized falconry, which is the science and the art of using falcons, these birds, to catch animals. And it's something that can be found in the Arab states, in Europe, in Mongolia, in Korea. And so while some of the aspects of it are a little bit different in each country, the basic science of raising these birds and training the birds is quite similar and is a shared tradition. And so in this sense, the communities become defined in a quite open-ended way. What the convention says is communities are networks of people whose sense of identity or connectedness emerges from a shared historical relationship that is rooted in the practice and transmission of or engagement with their intangible cultural heritage. So with the case of falconry, it was believed that it originated somewhere and then spread and then became quite different in the places where it ended up. And so this still doesn't answer all the questions, of course, of what is a community. So we still have to ask ourselves, how do we define the boundaries of communities? How do we exclude or include certain members? Likewise, how do we define community heritage, especially when it becomes tied up with issues of land or with issues of minority identities, particularly within the framework of, say, nationalistic kinds of discourse? And then third, in any one community, supposing we've managed to say, okay, we've defined the community, who speaks with the community? Who are the representatives? Do we always let the powerful people in the community speak on behalf of the community? And if so, what are the problems that we encounter by doing so? And so these are real challenges that we have to grapple with even as we try to work within the framework of the convention. I just want to summarize maybe a few key points at this stage. So first of all, we've talked a lot about the issue of community. So there's community ownership of ICH rather than the state ownership. So this convention, unlike other conventions, really says that if, for instance, a government wants to nominate to UNESCO a particular form of intangible cultural heritage, if the community that actually owns that heritage or practices that heritage does not agree, then the government would not be in a capacity to nominate it, which is very different from some of the other conventions that we have in the past where the government can basically do as it pleases. And so another thing is that if we make again a comparison with the World Heritage Convention, the World Heritage Convention is basically about trying to choose the things which are of outstanding universal value, that are somehow more old, or more historic, or more representative, or some really fantastic example of a certain kind of building, or etc. It's sort of like, in a way, almost a beauty contest, or it ends up being a beauty contest. The Intangible Heritage Convention is not at all like that. So, for instance, just now we had some oral traditions of some pygmy groups in Africa. It's not to say that their particular oral traditions are any more or less important than any other oral traditions of any other pygmy groups in that part of Africa or any part of the world. So it's not to say that it is somehow more resplendent or more fantastic than anything else. It's not a beauty contest. It's really about heritage which is recognized by the communities as being of value to them for whatever reason, and that's sufficient for it to be recognized. And then finally, the element must still be practiced. So sometimes we use the terms intangible cultural heritage and living heritage interchangeably, and the key word is very much the word living. So the idea that it's still in practice, although it may be in danger because only very few people practice it. And so the idea is that this convention opens the door to all these different other forms of cultural expressions, really widens our work in the heritage field much beyond the traditional work that some agencies have put into, for instance, great buildings and great artwork. At the same time, once again, the idea of intangible and intangible being somehow melded together, that the one and the other have to be considered together. And then finally, as we work with intangible cultural heritage, the focus of our work really has to be on safeguarding. In this case, the processes that are part of the intangible cultural heritage. And so the way that Alex framed the final assignment that all the groups will be working on, I think is very much reflective of this. So the idea is, how can we safeguard particular practices that we'll see in the 4 communities that we'll be working with through museums as the platform and as the vehicle, I think is very much in line with the aims and objectives of the convention. And so when we compare so-called safeguarding or conservation, and we look at tangible heritage practices versus intangible heritage things that are emerging, we can see that there's very much a shift away from simply looking at physical fabric, things and places, and looking more at the issues of significance and values, as well as continued practice. And unlike in the world of conserving heritage sites and objects, there's very much a shift away from letting the experts decide and letting the experts speak towards encouraging local voices and local decision making as much as possible. And then finally, instead of just trying to keep everything old in the same way that it was old when it was built, or authentic in terms of the way it looks or how it's built, or all of these other aspects of built heritage authenticity, there's a different form of thinking about it in terms of trying to maintain not the physical expression of the thing, but rather to maintain the value of the thing for the community, insofar as the community itself values that. And so it's very much a paradigm shift that we're engaging with, and I think many in the profession are still grappling with how to make this transition.